Welcome everyone to tonight's program with Sportswriter Keith O'Brien on his great new book, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose, and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. For the format for tonight is we'll be Keith and I will be talking about 40 minutes or so. Then we'll take a few minutes for question and answers from the audience here in the building and also online. Got a couple of quick announcements. Got some great virtual programs coming up. On May 23rd, we'll be talking with Monica Murphy and Bill Wasik about their new book, Our Kindred Creatures, about how Americans change their minds about how they treat animals. And then on June 5th, we'll be talking with Adam Higginbotham about his new great book about the Challenger disaster. So please join us then. Information is on our library website. So Mr. Keith O'Brien, he's a famous sports writer. He's written for a number of newspapers. He's written for a number of great books I'd recommend, like Seeing the Back, Fly Girls, and his great book on Love Canal, Paradise Falls. Really, I really recommend those books. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Keith tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, your book really opened my eyes about Mr. Pete Rose, but from my understanding, you have a picture of when he was on a youth baseball team, and it's really, in your view, it's really a great place to start.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'd love to start with that. So I'm going to share my screen here and pull up this photo. Just to give folks a sense of what we're looking at here, this is Pete Rose's 1956 city champion 15U baseball team. So, all the boys in this photo are 15 years old, and all of them, by the way, lived within maybe a 2 or 3 mile square radius on the west side of Cincinnati, which was a predominantly white German-Irish working class neighborhood, part of Cincinnati. And there's a few reasons why I love this photo. For starters, until it appeared in my book, this photo had really only existed in attics and shoeboxes on the west side of Cincinnati. It's really never been seen before. Beyond the fact that it includes Pete Rose and that this was a city champion team that goes on and wins a national championship, national tournament that year, rather, I think it shows a lot about Pete Rose. I mean, for starters, I don't think I have to point out to you or anyone else which one of these kids is Pete Rose. I mean, it's pretty clear if you know at all what he looks like. It's Pete Rose is sitting in the second row, second from the right there with the brown crew cut.
Okay. His hair hasn't changed much this hairstyle.
Right. I mean, what's fascinating is it's, not every 15-year-old boy looks like his future self, but Pete Rose really does in this photo. The second thing is he is not, the best player on this team. He's not even close to the best player on this team. The best player on this team is the boy with the blonde crew cut that is standing just over Pete's shoulder. That boy's name is Art Luby. He is about 6'2" in this photograph here, even though he's just 15 years old. Art Luby was a left-handed pitcher and incredibly talented. And in this season, 1956 season, Art Luby will never lose a game. Every time Art pitches Pete's team, the Green Stamps, they win. And so essentially they ride Art Luby to a city title. And if you had shown this photograph to anybody in Cincinnati, on the west side of Cincinnati in particular, in 1956 or 1957, and asked people, who do you think is going to be the future star, major league star on this roster, everybody would have pointed to Art Luby. But Art doesn't have that career. He goes to college and plays baseball briefly in college. Then he gives it up, and it is the boy sitting just below him who will go on to have that epic major league career. And I guess the last thing, Dan, that I think this photo shows is just how much smaller Pete was than the other boys here. I mean, Pete looks like he could be Art Luby's, kid brother. He doesn't look like, he's the same age even as some of these kids. And I think that says a lot about Pete, because, he will, develop this persona of hustle and having to work hard right here, on the west side of Cincinnati. We'll know it as fans later, but it will start here, on the west side as a boy, when Pete realizes that in order to make the team, in order to play on the team, he's going to have to work harder than the other kids. He's going to have to bring something else to the table, because he is simply, not, the most talented, not the most athletic gifted among his peers.
Yeah, his dad really drove him. Was a strong figure throughout his life. He encouraged him to the point where, like, he had to repeat sophomore year in high school, and because he just wasn't concerned about school. He was concerned about baseball and sports.
Yeah, his father, it was named Harry Francis Rose, but everybody called him Big Pete. And he was like the original athletic star in the family. Big Pete was a prominent semi-pro football player on the west side of Cincinnati in the 1930s and 40s. And this was a time when there was no professional football team in Cincinnati. Big Pete would play football on the weekends, and then he would, work a job as a bank teller and a bookkeeper. And, from the moment that his son is born, his first son in 1941, Big Pete does seem fixated on the idea that the boy, little Pete, will be an athletic star. And you're right. I mean, in the Rose household, academics, at least for Pete, wasn't a priority. It wasn't a value. It was, sporting success. And, his father will really drive him. And, and that photo I just showed a minute ago, I tracked down a lot of those boys. They're obviously the same age as Pete Rose. They're now, about 83 years old, and not all of them are still with us. But those that I did contact, those that are still alive, had very few memories of their own fathers being at their games. This is the 1950s. They were working jobs, often blue collar jobs. They couldn't cut out early to come, see a youth baseball game. But all of them remember Big Pete being there, on the sideline, on the fence line, urging his son on. And, we didn't have a word for Big Pete back then, but we do now. He's sort of the crazy youth sports dad that populates baseball fields all across America in 2024. But the thing is Pete, doesn't rebel against this message that his father's giving him. He believes it. He wants to make it happen, and he will, work hard. Not just to make the team because he wants to, but because he knows it's important for his father.
Yeah, in other sports where you do a great job of describing how Pete trained to be a boxer and how one boxing match really turned turned the corner of his life.
Yeah, yeah. In April 1957, uh, Pete is struggling mightily at school as a sophomore. He's struggling to the point that he's in danger of failing out. And as I point out in the book, this is a time when many parents would have focused on the schooling, on the academics, and what does Big Pete do? He gives him more sports, and it is boxing this time. And I was able to interview Pete Rose for this book. I did 27 hours of recorded interviews with Pete until he stopped calling me back, until he shut down. But in those interviews, we talked about this moment, April 1957, and Pete's father pushing him into a boxing ring. And Pete told me, he wasn't very fond of boxing. It was too much practicing. It wasn't enough actual competition. And let's be honest, in this early fight, he's fighting a boy who is far more experienced than him. Virgil Cole was his name. And that night, in a little smoky armory in downtown Cincinnati, Pete, he gets it handed to him, and really gets beat up in front of this crowd. And something happens after this fight that will happen many times in Pete's life, and in fact, in some ways, is still happening today. Even though he gets pummeled out there. Pete sort of spins it and tells a story that works for him. And he says, well, at least he couldn't knock me down. He couldn't knock me out. And what he was saying by that was, yeah, I got my butt kicked here tonight, but he couldn't best me. I was too tough to knock down. But it's notable because it is effectively the end of Pete Rose's boxing career. It starts and then it ends, and the teenager who does win the fight that night, Virgil Cole, dines off that, for years, in Cincinnati. He was the boy who beat up Pete Rose, one of the most famous people in town by the 1960s and 70s.
Oh yeah, I found it very touching. I mean that was even though he's a custodian, I believe, he was still proud that he was the guy that got knocked Pete Rose down.
Right, exactly.
Now in when you were talking with him for the time you did, Pete Rose, uh, did you? Were there other examples of how you just described how he spun the events to what he viewed or what he liked or how he made himself look good?
Well, I mean, yes. So, to be fair to Pete for a second, I think we all do this to a certain extent. When
Sure,
we tell
sure.
stories, we're always telling it from our perspective, and so it probably does often make all of us look better. But I will say this is a particular skill that Pete has. He does almost rebrand moments many times in his life. He does it, with this fight against Virgil Cole in 1957. He will do it a few years later when he's given the nickname Charlie Hustle, the title of my book. This nickname, was given to him during spring training, 1963. And I really wanted to identify exactly when it was given to him. I wanted to know the exact moment. And so I did a lot of reporting around this. And I can tell you that it happens during a game against the New York Yankees, March 17th, 1963. at old Al Lopez Field in Tampa, Florida, which was the spring training home of the Cincinnati Reds for many years. And it's a huge deal, this game, even though it's just a practice game, because the Yankees, were the team of the decade, the team of the century. This is, the New York Yankees with Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris and Yogi Berra and Whitey Ford. And the Cincinnati Reds never play the Yankees, because there's no interleague play. So this is a big deal. The game is carried live back in Cincinnati on TV, a practice game. They're very rare in 1963. And it's sold out. It's a sellout at Al Lopez Field. And Pete Rose plays that day with the kind of fury that we'll know later. He's going to get on base to start the game. He's going to scamper all the way around the bases, score the first run of the game, sliding head first. He's going to break up double plays, sliding hard. And then he's going to lead off the fifth inning, bunting for a hit in a practice game, right? And this is like a breaking point for Mickey Mantle, and anybody who knows anything about Mickey Mantle knows he doesn't bunt. He's not a bunter.
No.
Right. And here's this kid, rookie, nobody, bunting in a spring training game for a hit. And what transpires on the steps of the Yankee dugout isn't exactly clear. In the days ahead, the newspapers will have different accounts. Some will say that Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford called him Henry Hustle. Some will say that they called him the Charlie Hustler. And then they will settle on a story. The press will settle on a story that works for them. They say that they called him Charlie Hustle. And it wasn't intended to be a compliment. They were effectively laughing at him, right? They thought he was playing too. They thought he was playing too hard. Pete rebrands that. He does that thing where he goes from town to town that year when he makes the major league roster, and he tells all the sports writers that Mickey Mantle called him Charlie Hustle. He liked the way that I played, and it works. He does make it into a compliment, and in some ways he's still doing that today. I mean, if you interview Pete, as I did, and you talk to him about the hard things to talk about, the gambling, the mistakes, Pete always has a way to explain it that tries to make him look as best as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, I was a little kid at the time. I read Sports Illustrated and saw the glory days of Cincinnati Reds. My uncle and aunt lived in Cincinnati. They had season tickets, Riverfront Stadium. So it just, reading the book really was kind of like the flip side. You're opening up a lot of eyes. I also must commend you on the all the reporting, all the people that you talk to get at his story. And read an article you wrote in the Airmail website, and what struck out to me is you said that there are a lot of people still angry at him.
Yeah.
Like they were hoping maybe to change him, or if he could change to what were the kinds of what did people say, or what did people say in that vein?
Well, yeah. So I tried to interview anyone who crossed paths with Pete in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, in particular, the peak of his fame. And so that includes, former teammates, guys he played against, journalists, broadcasters, two former commissioners of baseball, and really his entire inner circle of guys. And some of these guys, have been in his inner circle for almost 50 years, and they're still close with him, and others have been sort of long ago exiled. The one thing I found is that, if you were in Pete's inner circle at one point, and you were no longer. People struggled with that. And you know, listen, Pete makes a lot of poor decisions over the years, and many of those decisions hurt people, and they carry that with them still today. And I think, one thing that was interesting about those folks is that even if they had been hurt and they carried those feelings, with them, at times they still, seem to wish that they were back in with Pete, and it sort of defies reason, right? If you've been hurt so badly by someone that you're still upset about it decades later, why would you want to be back, hanging out with that person? But I did, get a sense of what they must have felt. I will say, in those interviews I did with Pete, some of them were in person, 3 days of interviews in person. And we would sit across a table, at one of his favorite restaurants in Las Vegas, where he lives. And, people have asked me, did Pete Rose try to charm you? And the thing is, no, he didn't try to charm me. Pete Rose just is charming. That's sort of, he's got a thing about himself. He's got a charisma about him, and you feel that when you sit at a table with him. And so, I was fortunate to get that access, because in sitting with Pete, I got to understand even just a fraction of what some of his, long ago friends must have felt, or, his first wife must have felt, having had that, close access to Pete Rose. And it did help me understand, why they would feel this way all these many decades later.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like being the close to the toast of the town. You get all these benefits, and but he was also very generous to people, African American members of the team, like what was it, Frank Robinson. Frank Robinson, and you described how he's very friendly with people on the lower rung of the team. There weren't the stars, like you talk about how Pete did a nice thing for Terry Francona. So do you think that was out of charisma, or just simply trying to be nice?
I think people love to paint Pete Rose in white or black. And I think the truth is, like most of us, he's complex, he's gray. And for me, that makes for a far more interesting, subject,
Yeah.
And so, no, I think, just as Pete has made mistakes that hurt lots of people, and maybe in some ways still can't reckon with that, he has been very generous over the years, at times with friends, with teammates. You mentioned Frank Robinson. So in 1963, when Pete comes up as a rookie, that year that he's been, dubbed Charlie Hustle by Mickey Mantle, he makes the major league roster and he jumps the line. He enters that spring training really fourth on the depth chart at second base. And by opening day, he's the starting second baseman for the Cincinnati Reds. He's not in the minors anymore. And, Pete's incredibly confident, bordering arrogant. He doesn't, say things like a rookie would have said in 1963. He says what's on his mind, and he, all of this rubs many of his teammates the wrong way, and he's essentially, an outcast on his own team as a rookie, and it's Frank Robinson, and Vada Pinson, two of the of the black players on the 1963 Reds who befriend him. As Frank Robinson will say later, we befriended him because we understood what it was like to be an outcast. And it's almost like Pete pays that back many times down the line. In the 1970s, there's a couple of young players that come up with the Reds who, at least initially, don't seem that promising. One of them is Ken Griffey Sr. And Rose, when Griffey comes to town, Rose gives him suits. He gives him clothes. Ken Griffey has, nothing. And Rose gives him clothes to wear. And another one was another big member of the Big Red Machine, George Foster. And George Foster is traded to the Reds in the early 1970s, and it takes him a while, Foster, to sort of find it and catch on as an everyday starter. And there's a scene that I found in my research in the newspapers of a night in 1972, 73. The Reds are struggling. It's after a day game, and Pete Rose wants to go hit right away. He wants to roll the batting cage out to home plate at Riverfront Stadium and hit and not go home. And Sparky Anderson, the manager of the Reds, realizes he can't say no. When Pete Rose wants to hit, he's gonna hit, and so he does. And who comes out to shag balls in the outfield while a coach is throwing but George Foster? And this coach, throws pitches to Pete Rose until his arm's about to fall off, and he's done. And but Foster's been scampering all over the outfield, gathering up the balls for the last hour. And so Rose says, hey, you want to hit? And Foster, was almost like surprised, like, you mean me? And he's like, yeah, you want to hit? And he does. And there was this, great story I found about in the newspaper. And I was fortunate enough to interview George Foster. And I wondered, if he would remember this moment. Again, it's 50 years ago. George Foster has taken batting practice, thousands, tens of thousands of times, maybe more. What's the chances that he would remember? But Foster absolutely remembered, because he told me no player, no star, and specifically he said no white star, had ever shown me the kind of attention that Pete Rose did.
Yeah, and Pete Rose also, he was also very, almost was like one of the first free agents, maybe. He was always concerned about getting the best salary. I mean, yeah, to make sure he lived accordingly. But he was almost, you got the sense that it was like he was one of the first free agents, or that he was right out there getting the salary. Yeah, it may have been for himself, but it certainly set the path for others.
Yeah, you said it, Dan. I mean, in the 1960s and 70s, before free agency, players didn't like to talk about their salary in the newspaper, and at times it wasn't even announced what they were getting. And Pete Rose was ahead of his time. I mean, he was just out there in the public with the reporters saying what he believed he was worth. And if he thought he was, underpaid, he'd say it. And yeah, in 1978, he hits the free agent market for the first time. And free agency is a new thing. It's like 2 years old. But 77 was really like the first big year of free agency, and he's hitting it in the second year. He signs what was at the time one of the most lucrative contracts in baseball. It was a 4-year, $3.2 million deal with the Philadelphia Phillies. And it sounds like almost peanuts now. I mean, the highest paid player in 2024 is Shohei Ohtani, who is making he just signed a $700 million contract, a 10-year, $700 million contract. Shohei would be making in about a third of the season what Rose made in the entirety of his Phillies contract. But free agency and those changes are important, and it's all part of the backdrop of this story, because hopefully for me, this is more than just a story of a man. It's a story of a time in baseball. And in the time that Pete Rose is in professional baseball, everything changes. He's a rookie minor leaguer in 1960, and he's banned from baseball in August 1989. It's 30 seasons of professional baseball. And in that time, everything changes. Baseball goes from being this unpolished, raw sport filled with characters who did and said things on and off the field that they could never get away with, in 1989, and definitely couldn't get away with today. And all of these guys worked off-season jobs. And by 1989, the best players are multimillionaires. The owners are borderline billionaires, and baseball has signed, its first billion-dollar television contract. I mean, the sport has become mainstream and really corporate in a way it wasn't before.
You believe it's an article in Political where you touch upon how you just said how sports is becoming very corporate. How you touch in the Political article about how sports media, sports writers in general are shrinking. The sports media is very contained. Teams they control access, control stories. They're really on top of it's in essence trying to make it wholesome, make it clean, I was just, and how you draw a contrast in book and how Sports Illustrated was able to ferret out the story about Pete Rose, how essentially it probably wouldn't be possible today.
I mean, yeah, all of that is crucial to the Pete Rose story. It's funny, in the last 60 years, it's almost like we've come full circle on our sports reporting in a different way. In the 1960s and 70s, sports writers, beat writers had incredible access to these guys. And in some ways that access, helped us know them in a way that, fans had never known, athletes before. But because they were so close, because they had all this access, and because, frankly, there wasn't the kind of financial divide between a journalist and a player in the 1960s as there is today, these guys sometimes became really close. And so sports writers were telling us a story about our favorite athletes that we wanted to hear, and not necessarily the true story. And, today, we've come full circle where there's no access. Players, are sort of, sealed behind these walls that reporters, struggle to penetrate. There are strict times on when you can or can't ask questions, who you can ask questions of. Oftentimes, the only time we get to interview a famous athlete is when they're sitting at the podium after the game, and you're in a room full of 40 or 50 or 100 reporters. I mean, that's not access. That's just Q&A. And so so now we don't have the access, and we don't really know these guys, and so we're getting, again, sort of a diluted version of what is probably the real story. But back to that thing you mentioned, Dan, because it is so crucial. In 1989, Sports Illustrated gets a tip that Pete Rose has been betting on baseball and betting on the Reds, and they throw a team of people at it after vetting the tipster, doing a quick phone call with the tipster to see if maybe it has the potential to be true. They throw 4 or 5 reporters at it, and they go after it, and yeah. We don't see that very often today. There are a scant few news organizations who are willing to throw or able to throw 3, 4, 5 reporters at a sports story, even a sports scandal. And I think in some ways we've seen that even with the recent Shohei Ohtani, Ippei Mizuhara scandal, the scandal involving one of the most famous players in baseball, the most famous player in baseball today, and his interpreter, and alleged gambling and alleged gambling debts to the tune of millions of dollars. It feels like even though we're a month or more into that scandal, we still don't really know that much.
Yeah, what are your thoughts about that? Because that sort of makes Pete Rose's bets seem rather small.
Well, I mean, obviously, if there's a key distinction here, 2 of them actually. For starters, there is no indication at this time that Shohei Ohtani was betting himself. That's number 1. Number 2, there's no indication that anyone was betting on games, baseball games.
Okay.
And so, and that's what Pete Rose was doing. Pete Rose was betting on games that he was managing. My reporting shows he was betting on games that he was playing in. So that's a key difference because that is against the rules of baseball. But you're right. The money here is stunning. It's significant, and I think there remains a raft of unanswered questions about Ippei Mizuhara, the interpreter for Shohei Ohtani, and his alleged gambling. For me, there are a lot of gaping holes in this story that simply don't make sense. And in 1989, when Major League Baseball was investigating Pete Rose, there were lots of reporters who were investigating him too. It started with Sports Illustrated, but it didn't end there. And there were just so many journalists on the story, and that simply isn't the case in this story now. In 2024, 35 years later, the LA Times has done some incredible reporting. ESPN has done some incredible reporting. And yet we still have, I believe, an incredible number of unanswered questions.
Well, a couple more questions. Pete Rose was very charming. I mean, he got along with the media because he was the one person that would talk to them. I mean, when no matter win, lose, he'd be out there. I think you described how he gave one guy 3 columns during a conversation. Do you think that sort of helped or gave the media at that time sort of have them like, maybe we shouldn't talk about his many affairs or his gambling or stuff like that? Because there are guys walking around the clubhouse and they're really, other players are like, what? Who's that?
Yeah, I think the press was drawn to Pete Rose for a couple of reasons. One was the reason you pointed out. He was accessible. He did like to talk about baseball. He was happy to talk to reporters before and after games at length about the game. or about what happened, or about his teammates, or about a moment. He loved that. And the press loved him because he was so accessible. I do think there's another thing that's a bit more subtle, though. Major League clubhouses did not allow female reporters until 1979. No women allowed in the clubhouse, even journalists. And so, for the first 15, 16 years of Pete's major league career, the press corps is entirely male, and it is almost entirely white. And these reporters, were often, from working class backgrounds, just as Pete was. And so they gravitate toward him, because he looks like them, he talks like them. And yes, he's accessible. And to be fair to the reporters, they're drawn to him because of his story. Pete Rose's story, going back to that photo I showed it here at the outset, is that sort of classic American bedtime story that if you work hard, if you try hard, if you dedicate yourself, you can do anything. And that's the Pete Rose story. And we as fans, we as Americans, we love that story. We love that underdog story, and Pete had it. And so, part of the, what I wanted to do with this book, Charlie Hustle, was, remind us why we cared about Pete Rose in the first place. So that means going back and telling the story of that rise, the story of, all those glory moments, because there were, many moments of glory on the field with Pete Rose. And then tell the story of that fall, by his own choices, his own decisions, and frankly, his own addictions. I think that is far more than just a compelling baseball story. I think that's, a compelling human story.
Yeah, I guess the last question is that last sentence. Was that the reason you wrote the book, wanted to write the book?
Yeah, I'd say two reasons. One, Dan, I'm from Cincinnati, born and raised in Cincinnati. And I'm too young to remember the Big Red Machine years, but I'm in the wheelhouse of my love for baseball when Pete returns to the Reds in 1984. I remember exactly where I was on the night that he set the all-time hit record in 1985. And, I remember all the feelings that we had as Cincinnatians, as baseball fans in 1989 when Pete Rose, gets in trouble. And so, I believed that, if I could get access to Rose and his inner circle, that this was, a tale of, Shakespearean proportions, about, the classic underdog who through his own choices, by and large, loses it all, and then creates this field of wreckage for us. And I do think that's what it is. I think, there's a reason why we're still talking about Pete Rose 35 years later. It's because we still, don't know, what to do with him, how to classify him, where to put him, where he belongs. We don't know. He created a ton of cultural wreckage for us.
Yeah, and people want to classify other people, and if you can't, you keep talking about them like we do.
Right.
So, okay. Well, thank you very much. We'll move on to the Q&A portion. And anybody here have a question? Okay, let's take a look online here. All right. Got some. Yeah, what's up?
How was his relationship with Joe Morgan?
So Joe Morgan is traded to the Reds in late 1971, joins early 1972, and a couple interesting things about that. When Morgan is traded, he is considered a quote troublemaker in Houston. and this is a loaded term. This term was applied in the 1970s, but elsewhere, oftentimes to minority players who were outspoken or didn't toe the line. And it's fascinating to me that, at the time that Morgan joins the Reds, he's being called a troublemaker and is indeed even asked about it on the day of the trade. And Pete Rose is already betting with bookies, on the west side of Cincinnati, not on baseball, but on football, on basketball. He's already, making decisions that are going to lead him down the path to the problems he's going to have later. And even in this moment, Sparky Anderson is worried about Joe Morgan. And so he asked the clubhouse attendant to give him the locker next to Pete Rose, so that Pete Rose can sort of show him, how to play the game right. And I mentioned that because when Morgan arrives and, gets that locker next to Pete, he is told by a teammate that he has a choice to make as a Cincinnati Red. He can be friends with Pete Rose or he can be friends with Johnny Bench. He can't be friends with both, he's told. And Morgan chooses Rose. And those two do have a very close friendship for the entirety of the 70s, but even beyond. And it's Joe Morgan in the early 2000s who is lobbying then Commissioner Bud Selig to reinstate Pete Rose. But time and again, Pete disappoints Joe. He with the comments he makes, with the decisions he makes, Joe, is disappointed, by Pete or let down by Pete. And I think honestly, that is the addiction coming through there. Anyone who's ever dealt with a friend or a loved one who struggles with addiction, knows that kind of disappointment. And I do believe Joe felt that many times.
Okay. Yeah. I loved how you had the quote, Mike Schmidt was getting in a Hall of Fame ceremony, and you hear the crowd saying, "We want Pete," because Mike was extolling Pete's virtues, and then you point out all the Hall of Famers on the dais, and they're like Johnny Bench was like, "You can have him." But so
yeah, that's a great moment. It's a great scene for sure in the book.
Yeah, let's try Q&A. Oh yeah, can we have contact to purchase his book? Which would be next question. I
What's
guess
the question, right?
Yeah, and the question was about his many affairs, especially with I believe it was Terry Rubio.
Yes.
Was she underage at the time?
So no, Terry Rubio, one of Pete's mistresses, was in her early 20s when they began their relationship, which would last almost 3 years in the 1970s. I think what's being conflated is that Pete did, have an affair with a high school girl in Cincinnati in the 1970s. How old she was at the time is under dispute and not clear, and frankly may never be known. But what is clear is that he did have a relationship, with a high school girl in the 1970s in Cincinnati.
Okay. One more.
When you're talking to Pete, did you guys ever discuss when Pete barreled over the catcher to win the All-Star game? Did that ever come up?
The Ray Fosse.
Ray Fosse.
So what's the question about Ray
Yeah,
Fosse?
You guys ever discussed that?
did you guys discuss that incident, that play?
Yeah, actually, I'll show you a photo that I also really love. So yeah, the Ray Fosse story is critical because to me, this right here is the moment when Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose. This is there's a famous photograph that many baseball fans will remember of this collision. That's the one where Rose is just making contact with Fosse and he's bracing himself, and you can actually see the glove starting to fly off Fosse's hand. I preferred to use this photo, which is probably snapped about 2 seconds later, and Fosse is laying there in the dirt, and Rose is standing over him as he's being hugged by his National League teammate Dick Dietz. I say this is the moment when Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose because, in the 1960s, most people had never seen him play, either in person or on television. That changes on this night. That 1970 All-Star game was watched by 50 million people. 50 million. I mean, people were freaking out recently, during the women's Final Four because they were drawing such large audiences, the Caitlin Clark games. I think the women's final drew an audience of 18.7 million. An all-star game, a mid-season exhibition game in 1970 draws 50 million people. And so, when Rose slams into Fosse to win the game, he really has sort of gilded the edges of his mythology on the whole Charlie Hustle thing. This is a guy who will do anything to win. And so, yeah, I talked to Rose about it at length. I did a ton of reporting about this night. I unfortunately was unable to interview Ray Fosse. He, as folks may know, he died in late 2021. My reporting, for this book began in the summer of 21. I reached out in the earliest weeks to the Oakland A's, where Fosse was an announcer, but he had already taken a leave of absence because he was already sick. So unfortunately, I couldn't interview Fosse, but I interviewed as many people as I could who were on the 1970 All-Star rosters. And I interviewed everyone who's at dinner the night before this game. And the night before this moment, in an incredible twist of fate that would really only happen to Pete Rose. Ray Fosse and his wife, Pete Rose and his wife, and a mutual friend, Sudden Sam McDowell, a pitcher for the Cleveland Indians, and his wife, have dinner together about 24 hours before this moment right here. And so, I interviewed, 4 of the people at that dinner the night before, as well as, others around the game that night to retell this story of the Fosse collision, because I think it is crucial to the story of Pete Rose.
Yeah, definitely. Good point. So I want to get people, if they're interested in purchasing the book, do you have a website or any place that
I'll share my screen quickly again. I do have a website here. You can go to keithob.com and purchase the book anywhere. There are links all over the website, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, all of them. And if you're looking for a signed copy, my local bookstore here in New Hampshire will ship. I go into the store all the time on a regular basis, sign books, and they ship them out. It's called Water Street Books. It's here in Exeter, New Hampshire. And if you go to the signed books section of the website, you can find me. And just be sure to note in the comment form, the sales order form, if you want it signed to a particular person, and I'd be happy to do that. And I will say that anyone who orders books through my local bookstore, I have something that I like to include. I have special edition Charlie Hustle bookmarks. You can read all of your future books with Pete Rose here. So if you order a signed copy through Water Street Books, I'll slip one of those bookmarks in there for you. And Dan, I should probably get you one just so you can have it there in the library.
Oh, thank you. And we also have books copies of your book here for sale if people here at the library would like to purchase it tonight.
Fantastic.
So,
Well, I'll
thank
send you
you.
some bookmarks then.
Thank you very much, Keith. It's great talking with you, and it's a great book. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
Thank you for having me.